over 50 years now, boys and girls and mums and dads have read and reread Kenneth Grahame's magical story of Mr. Toad and his friends Ratty, Mole and Badger. 4 animals who were sometimes so stupid and sometimes so wise that they were just like human beings. For those who've not yet had the pleasure of their company, and for the thousands who'd like to meet them again, this is the story of The Wind in the Willows. Poor Mole, how exhausted and terrified he'd felt, alone in the vast wild wood. And how thankful he was that Rat had found him. But then in the thick snow they'd become lost. Lost, that is, until they stumbled upon the front door of Mr. Badger. As the Rat waited patiently in the cold night air, with snow still falling, stamping his feet in an effort to keep warm, he could hear the deep-toned chimes responding to the efforts of Mole on the bell pull. There was the noise of a bolt pulled back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes. "The next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up, whoever you are." "Oh, Badger," cried the Rat. "Let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow." "Why, Ratty, my dear little man," exclaimed the Badger in a quite different tone. "Why, you must be perished. Bless my soul, lost in the snow, in the wild wood too, and at this time of night. Come along in at once." The Mole followed the Rat down a long, shabby passage. Off it he could see dimly other passages, mysterious and without apparent end. But there were doors as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors. The Badger followed up behind, wearing a long dressing gown and slippers that were down at heel. "This isn't the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. Oh, but let's go to the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything else." The Badger flung open one of the stout oak doors, and there, glowing in the light of a log fire, was a large room that seemed a place fit for heroes to feast in after victory. The floor was well-worn red brick. Around the fire were 2 settees with high backs and made for comfort and ease. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards placed on trestles, with benches down either side. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room, and from the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. The plates on the dresser grinned at the pots on the shelf. The merry firelight flickered and played over everything. The Mole had never felt more secure in his whole life. All that he'd suffered in the trackless wild wood seemed a half-forgotten dream. Within no time at all, the Badger had piled food before them, and they told him their story through mouthfuls of food and with their elbows on the table. You may think that was very rude, which of course it was, but the Badger took no notice. You see, he didn't do a lot of entertaining. He had the idea that these things didn't really matter. He sat in his armchair and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story. He wasn't surprised or shocked or anything, and never said, "I told you so," or oh dear, and the Mole began to feel very friendly towards him. And when at last they'd finished supper and were feeling warm, content and full, they sat round the great wood fire, and the Badger said, "Now then, what's the news from your part of the world? How's old Toad getting along?" "From bad to worse," said the Rat gravely. "Another smash-up last week, and a bad one. He will insist on driving himself, and he's so incapable. But he thinks that nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest follows. Do you know he's had 7 crashes now? And he's been in hospital 3 times, put in the Mole, and had to pay some very heavy fines." "Yes, and that's part of the trouble," went on the Rat. "I know Toad's rich, but he's not a millionaire. He'll be ruined or killed before long." "Badger, We're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something? Well, look here, said the badger. I can't do anything now, as I'm sure you understand. And his two friends did indeed understand. No animal is expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. After arduous days and nights in the summer, when their muscles and nerves have been so severely tested, winter was the time for rest and sleep. But I tell you what, said the badger, once the spring comes and we're wanting to be out once more, how about then? All the animals agreed that then they would do something about the wayward toad. And with that, the badger escorted the rat and the mole to the guest room. Even here was the overflow of Badger's winter stores. All around were piles of apples, turnips and potatoes, baskets full of nuts and jars of honey. But to one side, two soft and inviting little beds, clean and smelling of lavender. Within 30 seconds of tumbling into them, the rat and the mole, full of joy and contentment, were fast asleep. The two animals came down to breakfast very late next morning. There was a bright fire burning in the kitchen and two young hedgehogs sitting at a bench at the table eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. "Good heavens, where have you youngsters come from?" said the rat pleasantly. "Lost your way in the snow, I suppose?" "Yes, please, sir," said the elder of the two hedgehogs. "We were trying to find our way to school in the snow, and we lost ourselves, sir, and little Billy here got frightened, and we happened up against Mr. Badger's front door, and Mr. Badger, being the kind-hearted gentleman he is, as everyone knows—" "I understand," said the rat, cutting himself some rashers from a side of bacon. "And where's Mr. Badger now?" "He's in his study, sir, and he says he's very busy and on no account to be disturbed." They all sat down to breakfast, fully understanding what the badger had meant about not being disturbed. The fact is, as already mentioned, that when you live a life of full activity for 6 months of the year and of near sleep for the other 6, you can't be continually pleading tiredness to guests. It sounds rude. And the animals knew full well that after eating a hearty breakfast, the badger had returned to his study, settled himself in an armchair, put his handkerchief over his face, and was being busy in the usual way. The front doorbell clanged loudly, and one of the hedgehogs rushed off to see who it might be. There was the sound of voices and stamping in the hall, and then who should walk into the room but the otter. "Thought I'd find you here," said the otter. "There's a great state of alarm along the riverbank. They said Rat and Mole hadn't come home last night. Thought something dreadful must have happened, especially with all this thick snow lying about. But then I thought that anyone in trouble comes to Badger, so along I came." The otter joined them at the table and helped himself to breakfast. My, what a lovely sight it was coming through the wood. The white snow, the red sun rising, and stillness everywhere. Could have stayed and had fun there for hours in all that snow. About halfway through, I came across a rabbit, stupid creature, sitting on a stump. Had to cover his ears a bit to get any sense out of him. Still, he told me how you'd lost your way, Mole, and how they were out hunting and chivying around. The Mole looked on in awe at this seemingly fearless animal talking so casually about the terrible wild wood. "I asked that fool rabbit," went on the otter, "why he and his many friends didn't take you, Moley, down a burrow and give you shelter. But he just looked dim and stupid. They're all the same, those rabbits." "Weren't you at all nervous coming through the wood?" asked the Mole. "Nervous?" said the otter. "I'd give 'em nerves if any of 'em tried anything on me." A loud yawn came from the doorway, and there stood the still sleepy badger. "Hello, Otter," he said. And then, seeing the two hedgehogs still there, he told them it was time to go, or their mother would be getting worried, and he sent them off with a pat on the head and 6pence in their pockets. It was well after lunch, and the badger, knowing the Mole to be another underground creature, was showing him around his home. They walked through a labyrinth of tunnels, and by the light of the badger's lantern, the mole was astonished to see this vast underground empire. There were rooms on either side, some small and absolutely packed with winter stores, some vast, the size of Toad's dining hall. And as they went round on their expedition, the badger and mole both agreed how only underground, away from the weather and the overflowing rivers, away from drafts and noisy neighbours, could an animal feel really safe, secure and happy. And here and there were arches and pillars and even pavements. And the badger explained how many thousands of years ago a city had stood at this spot, which had since been overcome by nature's growth, and that all he'd done was excavate the various passages and rooms, and he hadn't needed to shore up the structure at all. When they got back to the kitchen, the rat was dressed and ready for the outdoors, complete with his pistols and cudgel. "Come on, Mole," he said. "We ought to make a move for home now. We don't want to spend another night in the wild wood." So all four animals set off this time down the tunnels to a secret exit that the badger assured them would bring them out on the edge of the wood and not far from the river bank. And soon they were out in the open again, in the cold winter's air, the otter, the rat, and the mole trudging across a large field. Before them they could see a glint of their familiar old river, while the wintry sun hung red and low on the horizon. For a moment, the mole paused and looked back at the whole mass of the wild wood, dense and menacing in its vast white surroundings. And then the mole saw clearly that he was an animal of tilled field and hedgerow, linked to the ploughed furrow, the frequented pasture, the cultivated garden plot. For others, perhaps, the stubborn endurance, the clash of actual combat that went with nature in the rough. But he must be wise, must keep to the present places in which his lines were laid, and which held adventure enough in their way to last for a lifetime. In episode 7, the mole feels homesick. So, on a cold winter's night, he takes the rat through woods, fields and hedges to find Mole End.